The Bolsheviks had seized power. Now they had to ensure they maintained it. The revolution, of course, angered leaders in capitalist countries and the bourgeoisies they served, but they believed the Bolsheviks could not hold on to power. Quote, now power had been seized by another class, a subject class, that in the judgment of these onlookers was incapable of ruling and should never have been permitted to acquire the opportunity. It was a disaster and a portent. It could not, must not, and would not be permitted to endure without a challenge. Murphy. Of course, people outside of Russia weren't the only ones opposed to the revolution. Former Tsarist forces, the Russian bourgeoisie, the overthrown provisional government, the Mensheviks, many of the SRs, and supporters of all of them also wanted to see its demise. Literally the day after the insurrection, there were so-called socialists, like SRs, denouncing the Bolsheviks, claiming that they had betrayed the revolution, had started a civil war, and would bring violence and slavery. Of course, they also made appeals based on nationalism and called for a continuation of Russia's involvement in the imperialist war. The Bolshevik Party itself was far from unified at this point. There were at least 3 trends. One was made up of leaders in the Central Committee including Lenin, Stalin, Sverdlov, and Dzerzhinsky, and those who agreed with them, representing the Leninist version of Marxism. There was a group created by Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Rykov, quote, with a policy at times indistinguishable from that of the Mensheviks, Ibid. And finally, there was a group of, quote, left communists, led by Bukharin, Radek, and Shliapnikov. Trotsky vacillated between groups, of course. Their views on the revolution itself were even different. Quote, Lenin was prepared to exploit the breakthrough to the full, realistically consolidate his forces, and get ready for the next stage of the struggle. He would therefore exploit this great victory to the uttermost, but the extent of that uttermost only life itself could reveal. Hence, to try to define the full scope of the revolution would, he held, be fatal to it. Ibid. He disagreed with Trotsky, who claimed that the revolution must extend to the boundaries of Western Europe, or it would fail. Kamenev and Zinoviev's group didn't think the Russian proletariat could lead the revolution, which is apparently why they had opposed the Bolsheviks taking power and vacillated frequently. The left communists called for a revolutionary war against the Germans and the full socialist program, though the new state lacked the means for either one. People outside Russia didn't know about these different trends and got the impression that Bolshevism was breaking down when a crisis would occur. At the Second Congress of Soviets, right after the insurrection, there were Bolsheviks, SRs, both left and right SRs, Mensheviks, and others. As one would imagine, there were plenty of disagreements and arguments. Mensheviks and right SRs even called for negotiation with the provisional government, which was refused. They also claimed the Bolsheviks had seized power illegally and left the Congress. Clearly, they were not interested in actual revolution. As they left, Trotsky said to them, quote, you are pitiful, isolated individuals. You are bankrupts. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, into the dustbin of history. Read. At the Congress, Lenin called for an end to the Great War, saying, quote, the government of Russia proposes to all warring peoples immediately to conclude such a peace. It expresses its readiness at once and without the slightest delay to take the necessary steps towards the final confirmation of the terms of such a peace by the plenipotentiary conventions of the representatives of all countries and all nations. Murphy. He then moved to the land question, legalizing land seizure from landlords, which the peasants had started doing before the insurrection. The Bolsheviks would have preferred nationalization/socialization and collective farms, but that was impractical at the time. This measure helped win the peasants over even more. In the first Soviet government, Lenin selected people for the Council of People's Commissars. Among the 15 were himself as chairman, Stalin as commissar for nationalities, though he still had his other responsibilities, Trotsky for foreign affairs, Lunacharsky for the people's education, Shliapnikov for labor, Alexei Rykov for home affairs, and Vladimir Milyutin for agriculture. Quote, none of the new departments of the new state had offices, not even that of the chairman. Ibid. Smolny Institute was still serving as headquarters, and was where the ongoing revolution was directed from. Stalin gave a mandate to SS Pestovsky, a Polish Bolshevik who would become his secretary, with which he secured half a large room in Smolny Institute to serve as the office for the Commissariat of Nationalities. Quote, he found a table and some chairs, posted a notice on the door, People's Commissariat for Nationality Affairs, borrowed 3,000 rubles from Trotsky, who had found money in the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and began to work. Ibid. Nationality issues weren't much involved with the work they were doing at the time, though. Pestovsky wrote, quote, Lenin could not get along without Stalin even for a single day. Probably for that reason, our office in the Smolny was under the wing of Lenin. In the course of the day, he would call Stalin out an endless number of times, or would appear in our office and lead him away. Most of the day, Stalin spent with Lenin. Gray. Lenin's improvised office was where he, Stalin, Sverdlov, and Trotsky would confer, draft declarations, and issue directives, though, according to Trotsky, it was just 3 of them most of the time, as Sverdlov was busy with the work of the party secretariat. These included the relaxation of marriage and divorce laws, the emphasis of gender equality, and giving so-called illegitimate children the same rights as so-called legitimate ones. Nationalization of industry also began, the banks were nationalized, and there were decrees getting rid of private property. The 8-hour workday was established, and workers would have a decisive voice in the management of industry via their elected committees. Homosexuality was decriminalized in December 1917, and its legalization confirmed in the RSFSR Penal Code of 1922. This remained true in the 1926 redrafting. Tsarist legal bans on gay civil and political rights were also rescinded by the Bolsheviks. Dan Healy remarked that archival material made more available after 1991, quote, demonstrates a principled intent to decriminalize the act between consenting adults, expressed from the earliest efforts to write a socialist criminal code in 1918 to the eventual adoption of legislation in 1922. However, the legalization only applied to the RSFSR, i.e., Russia proper, and the Ukrainian SSR. In other SSRs, homosexuality or sodomy remained a crime. In the state and the party, different people held different views on homosexuality and gay rights. Some were supportive, some were not, and some were ambivalent. The overall climate around the issue of gay rights fluctuated, with things becoming more negative at the end of the 1920s, when homosexuality was officially labeled a mental disorder and a disease. However, the official stance from the late 1920s can apparently be summarized by an article from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia of 1930. Quote, Soviet legislation does not recognize so-called crimes against morality. Our laws proceeded from the principle of protection of society, and therefore countenance punishment only in those instances when juveniles and minors are the objects of homosexual interest. Sirisky. I was going to discuss further changes in this area, but we'll save that for when we talk about the early to mid-30s. In February 1918, separation of church and state was declared, as was freedom of belief, and the Gregorian calendar was introduced. They put out many declarations and decrees that would function as guides for the commissariats once they were actually able to operate as well. Their decree for the Commissariat of Nationalities read, quote, 1. Equality and sovereignty of the peoples of Russia. 2. Free self-determination of the peoples of Russia, including the right to secede and form an independent state. 3. Cancellation of all national and national religious privileges and disabilities. 4. Free development of national minorities and groups of peoples who live in Russia. Murphy. At some point during this period, Zinoviev, Rykov, Milyutin, Vladimir Nogin, and Lunacharsky, who all opposed the Bolsheviks taking power yet accepted office after it was achieved, resigned. They apparently wanted to force a coalition government and, quote, they and Kamenev also were even prepared to consider a Menshevik proposal that Lenin and Trotsky should be excluded from any coalition government. Gray. They agitated for this cause until a statement, approved by the majority of the Central Committee and signed by Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, threatened that they would be expelled from the party. Quote, the threat had a sobering effect. Gray. The majority of the members of the provisional government were in prison, but the Mensheviks and SRs were still around, despite being in a state of disintegration. The old heads of the First Soviet Congress would not recognize the decisions of the Second, and used Soviet funds to finance strikes against the new Soviet government. They had control of the Railwaymen's Union, and convinced many of them to refuse to operate the railways. Telegraph and telephone exchange workers did something similar, as did bank staffs, and leaders of the Kerensky army refused to obey orders. On November 18th or 19th, 1917, New Style, The latter led to Lenin, Stalin, and Krylenko having a telegraph conversation with Commander-in-Chief, General Dukhonin, who was at Field HQ. Quote, "I recall," says Stalin, "how Lenin, Krylenko, and I went to staff headquarters in Petrograd. It was an anxious moment. Dukhonin and the army headquarters categorically refused to carry out the orders of the Council of Commissars. As regards the army of 12 million men under the control of the so-called army committees, it was unknown what their attitude would be. I recall how after a short pause at the wire, Lenin's face became lit up with an unusual light. It was clear that he had made his decision. Quote, "Let us go to the radio station," said Lenin. Quote, "It will render us a service. We will issue a special order removing General Dukhonin and appointing in his place as Commander-in-Chief, Comrade Krylenko, and we will appeal to the soldiers direct, over the heads of their officers, to arrest the generals, to suspend military operations, to establish contact with the Austro-German soldiers, and to take the business of peace into their own hands." Murphy. Field HQ was a place where counter-revolutionary activity was planned, until it was occupied by revolutionary troops on December 3rd. According to Murphy, quote, "As soon as Krylenko arrived at the front, Dukhonin was arrested and lynched by an infuriated mob of soldiers. Kamenev had been sent to deal with the railwaymen's strike, but was unable to end it, so Stalin was dispatched, and succeeded. Lenin also sent Stalin to Finland to help with the Finnish Revolution, and to negotiate with the Ukrainian Rada, and bring about its end. As Gray wrote, quote, "Stalin was directly involved in all of the major events of this time. He was already influential and indispensable to Lenin." Stalin spoke at the Helsinki Congress of the Finnish Social Democratic Labour Party on November 14, 1917. He spoke about some of the successes of the revolution in Russia and some of the ways their opponents tried to scare them. He also said, quote, "They tried to scare us with the bogey of the disintegration of Russia, of its splitting up into numerous independent states, and hinted thereby that the right of nations to self-determination proclaimed by the Council of People's Commissars was a fatal mistake. But I must declare most categorically that we would not be Democrats, I say nothing of socialism, if we did not recognize the right of the peoples of Russia to free self-determination. I declare that we would be betraying socialism if we did not do everything to restore fraternal confidence between the workers of Finland and Russia. But everyone knows that the restoration of this confidence is inconceivable unless the right of the Finnish people to free self-determination is firmly recognized. And it is not merely the verbal, even if official, recognition of this right that is important here. What is important is that this verbal recognition will be confirmed by the act of the Council of People's Commissars, that it will be put into effect without hesitation. For the time for words has passed. The time has come when the old slogan, 'Workers of all countries, unite,' must be put into effect. Complete freedom for the Finnish people, and for the other peoples of Russia to arrange their own life. A voluntary and honest alliance of the Finnish people with the Russian people. No tutelage, no supervision from above over the Finnish people. These are the guiding principles of the policy of the Council of People's Commissars. Only as the result of such a policy can mutual confidence among the peoples of Russia be created. Only on the basis of such confidence can the peoples of Russia be united in one army. Only by thus uniting the peoples can the gains of the October Revolution be consolidated and the cause of the International Socialist Revolution advanced. That is why we smile when we are told that Russia will inevitably fall to pieces if the idea of the right of nations to self-determination is put into practice. These are the difficulties with which our enemies have tried and are still trying to scare us, but which we are overcoming as the revolution grows. Comrades, information has reached us that your country is experiencing approximately the same crisis of power as Russia experienced on the eve of the October Revolution. And if you should need our help, you will have it. We shall extend you a fraternal hand. Of this you may rest assured." This lined up with the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, which Lenin and Stalin had signed a few days after the November Revolution. But understandably, Stalin deplored the fact that a bourgeois regime was in power in Finland, and criticized the Finnish Social Democrat Party for, quote, "its indecisiveness and incomprehensible cowardice," unquote, when making his report to the Central Executive Committee on the decree of Finland's independence. Gray. Bukharin and some others criticized him for supposedly yielding to bourgeois nationalism of small nations, but his position was made clear at the Third All-Russian Congress of Soviets a few weeks later. He said that, quote, "the right of self-determination was the right, not of the bourgeoisie, but of the toiling masses of a given nation. The principle of self-determination ought to be used as a means in the struggle for socialism, and it ought to be subordinated to the principles of socialism. Gray. SRs and other anti-Bolshevik forces had been trying to foment anti-Bolshevik sentiment in the public since the revolution began. They produced plenty of dishonest and ridiculous propaganda. Speaking on the October Revolution and the new Soviet government, the Executive Committee of Peasant Soviets, quote, refuted with indignation all participation of the organized peasantry in this criminal violation of the will of the working class. Read. And, of course, there were armed attempts at counter-revolution. Around November 12th, New Style, 1917, Kerensky rode a white horse into Tsarskoye Selo on the outskirts of Petrograd, accompanied by Cossacks. He demanded the rifle garrison lay down their arms, and they refused. The Cossacks fired on them, killing 8. This turned soldiers in Petrograd against Kerensky even more. There was further fighting over the following days, and the Red Guards triumphed over the Cossacks. The Cossacks fled, leaving behind their artillery. Moscow was taken by the Bolsheviks on November 15th, New Style, following intense fighting for the Kremlin. After this, there was even less anti-Bolshevik sentiment among the public. Lenin declared there was, quote, not a shadow of hesitation in the masses of Petrograd, Moscow, and the rest of Russia, unquote, in accepting Bolshevik leadership. Read. Soviets were created in Siberia on December 10th. A monarchist conspiracy was uncovered in Petrograd on December 12th. Generals Kornilov and Denikin met with General Alexiev in the Don region on the 22nd, preparing their counter-revolution. Alexiev, who had been chief of staff of Kerensky's army, was readying the Volunteer People's Army, also known as the White Army. Generals Kaledin and Dutov supported counter-revolution in Ukraine. The same month, Mensheviks in Tiflis seized the local arsenal. Also in December, Old Style, Lenin entrusted Dzerzhinsky with the organization of the new All-Russian Commission to fight counter-revolution and sabotage, also known as the Cheka, its short name. Murphy summed up the situation of the Bolsheviks during this time well, quote, these men had to direct a civil war, create the apparatus of government, organize an army, develop the Bolshevik Party with the utmost speed, and travel along uncharted routes of policy. It was a monumental task, but they did have an advantage, the Soviets, which they had supported when it seemed like every other group and party was turning away from them in hopes of Western parliamentarism. The Soviets reflected the will of the people and served as an effective connection between the party and the masses. Apparently, once they obtained a majority, they never lost it. Quote, the construction of the apparatus of government was not something imposed from Petrograd, but a calling to life of the means of administration from the masses and the Soviets. Ibid. For a while after the revolution, the Soviets were also where different parties fought out issues. Mensheviks and SRs had still been calling for a Constituent Assembly, which had been promised by the Provisional Government. When it met on January 18th, New Style, 1918, the Bolsheviks had a minority, and the majority party said that the Assembly should displace the Soviets. They also rejected the decrees on peace and land. The Bolsheviks said they should endorse the passing of power to the Soviets and dissolve, and then they withdrew. The Assembly was shut down the next day by decision of the Congress of Soviets. Quote, the Constituent Assembly passed into the night and nobody shed a tear for its passing. Power rested with the Soviets. Ibid. The events revealed to the masses that the Assembly wouldn't recognize the power of the Soviets. Calls for peace negotiations were rejected by the Allied powers, so the new Soviet government decided to negotiate with the Central Powers, resulting in the signing of an armistice on December 15th, New Style, 1917, in the German-controlled city of Brest-Litovsk. Brest is now a part of modern-day Belarus, on the border with Poland. The Soviet government advocated a peace without annexation or indemnities, and the right of self-determination for subject nations. Peace negotiations with the Quadruple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey began on December 22nd, New Style. A man named Adolf Joffe initially led the Soviet delegation in their meeting with Quadruple Alliance delegates. However, he was replaced by then Commissar for Foreign Affairs Trotsky partway through the process. When Trotsky took over, quote, the stage was his and he made tremendous use of it. Ibid. The strategy was to delay the proceedings in hopes of better circumstances, like revolution in Europe. He made speeches trying to address European workers over the heads of the German leaders. Quote, But such fireworks could be only of short duration. What then? What were the precise terms of peace to be? Ibid. When Trotsky asked for instructions via telegraph at some point around this time, Lenin responded on January 16th, New Style, 1918. Quote, Lenin here. I have just received your special letter. Stalin is away, and I have not yet been able to show it to him. I think your plan is worth discussing. Can its final implementation be somewhat deferred, and the final decision taken after a special Central Executive Committee meeting over here? I shall show the letter to Stalin as soon as he returns. Then, Lenin said, quote, I should like to consult Stalin before replying to your question. And eventually, he responded, quote, Stalin has just arrived. I shall discuss it with him, and will shortly let you know our joint reply. Lenin. Although the peace terms proposed by the Germans were severe, Lenin urged the Central Committee to accept them on January 20th, New Style, 1918, arguing the revolution needed breathing room. The terms would mean significant loss of territory and payment of an indemnity. Bukharin, Radek, and Pyatakov rejected this and demanded a, quote, revolutionary war against the Germans, which forces in opposition to the Bolsheviks also supported. Trotsky, who had returned with his new slogan, neither peace nor war, was in between Lenin's group and Bukharin's. Lenin warned that not accepting the terms could mean more severe demands, and said Trotsky was just engaging in futile word-spinning. They were not in a good bargaining position, but Trotsky insisted there would be a revolution in Europe. Stalin pointed out that there was no evidence of imminent revolution in Western Europe. However, Bukharin's and Trotsky's supporters had a majority, so when Trotsky went to the peace conference, which resumed on February 10th, New Style, he eventually made a speech based on his slogan, and refused to sign the treaty, after other speeches that didn't do much. Returning to Petrograd, Trotsky proclaimed he had won a diplomatic victory. He had not. Lenin was not convinced by this, and he was correct. The Germans announced the armistice would end on February 18th, New Style, and their army started to march, just as Lenin had said. The CC debated what to do, with Trotsky stubbornly sticking to his position, but Lenin's position finally won by a narrow majority. When the Germans replied to the message that the Soviet government would, under protest, accept the terms, they gave terms that were even harsher, just as Lenin had worried. The CC was outraged, and Bukharin shouted about how they should wage a supposed revolutionary war to the last man, which most of those present agreed with. Lenin calmly laid out the facts of their situation and demanded that the peace treaty be signed. He apparently even threatened to resign from the government if it wasn't signed, but the members continued debating. Finally, Lenin's position was approved. Bukharin voted against it, and, quote, Trotsky, unable to accept that his negotiations had failed or to realize the gravity of the situation, abstained. Gray. It almost goes without saying that Stalin supported Lenin's position. The Petrograd Soviet and the Central Executive Committee of the Congress of Soviets voted to accept the terms after heated debate. Murphy wrote there were 126, or 116 according to Kotkin, votes to 85, with 26 abstentions and 2 absentees. On March 3rd, New Style, 1918, the treaty was finally signed. Unfortunately, the terms meant that the country lost 1.267 million square miles of territory, which included a population of 62 million, along with 27% of the agricultural land, 26% of the railways, and 75% of the iron and steel industry. More specifically, Russia lost Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and most of Belarus. Later, when Germans complained about the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, the Allied powers remarked that it was tame compared to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. But, most importantly, the revolution had been saved. Quote, and as before, Lenin not only won the struggle but raised his prestige enormously. Again, in a decisive hour, he had saved the revolution when Trotsky and his supporters had nearly lost it. This time, however, Lenin did not have to fight single-handed. Stalin and Sverdlov were his principal lieutenants. Murphy. The Bukharin group took their opposition to great lengths, mobilizing some party members against Lenin and his group, and apparently even preparing to arrest Lenin, Stalin, and Sverdlov. From March 6th to 8th, 1918, the extraordinary 7th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, was held. On March 7th, Lenin reported, quote, the severe crisis which our party is now experiencing, owing to the formation of a, quote, left opposition within it, is one of the gravest crises the Russian Revolution has experienced. This crisis will be overcome. Under no circumstances will it break the neck of our party or of our revolution, although at the present moment it has come very near to doing so. There was a possibility of it. The revolution will not come as quickly as we expected. History has proved this, and we must be able to take this as a fact, to reckon with the fact that the world socialist revolution cannot begin so easily in the advanced countries as the revolution began in Russia, in the land of Nicholas and Rasputin. But to start without preparation a revolution in a country in which capitalism is developed and has given democratic culture and organization to everybody, down to the last man, to do so would be wrong, absurd. There we are only just approaching the painful period of the beginning of socialist revolutions. This is a fact. Yes, we shall see the world revolution, but for the time being it is a very good fairy tale, a very beautiful fairy tale. I quite understand children liking beautiful fairy tales, but I ask, is it proper for a serious revolutionary to believe in fairy tales? It will be a good thing if the German proletariat is able to take action. But have you measured it? Have you discovered an instrument that will show that the German Revolution will break out on such and such a day? No, you do not know that, and neither do we. You are staking everything on this card. If the revolution breaks out, everything is saved, of course. But if it does not turn out as we desire, if it does not achieve victory tomorrow, what then? Then the masses will say to you, you acted like gamblers. You staked everything on a fortunate turn of events that did not take place. You proved unfitted for the situation that actually arose instead of the world revolution, which will inevitably come, but which has not yet reached maturity. But now you are assisting German imperialism, because you have surrendered wealth valued at millions in guns and shells, and anybody who had seen the state, the incredible state of the army, could have predicted this. Having been taught this lesson, we shall overcome our split, our crisis. As Murphy noted, Lenin's support for what would be termed socialism in one country is hinted at here. Quote, for if the revolution in Europe still belonged to the realm of fairy tales, then the Russian Revolution had to make up its mind whether it would be a socialist revolution or surrender to capitalism. Lenin's opening sentence to the triumphant Congress of Soviets which took into its hands the government of Russia, "We will now begin the construction of socialism," could leave no doubt as to where he stood on the matter. Other quotes from Lenin provide even more evidence that he supported this stance, but we'll get into that in a future part. Concerning Trotsky's actions, Lenin said, quote, we must discern two aspects in his activities. When he started negotiations at Brest and made excellent use of them for the purpose of agitation, we were all in agreement with him. But it had been arranged between us that we would hold out until the Germans presented us with an ultimatum, and that when the ultimatum was presented, we would yield. Insofar as Trotsky's tactics were directed towards playing for time, they were correct. They became wrong when the state of war was declared to be at an end, and peace was not signed. Ibid. Of course, the terms wouldn't have been as severe if peace had been signed earlier, as Lenin had urged. People were angry about the signing of the treaty for a little while, reacting out of national pride or nonsense about waging a revolutionary war against the Germans. The left SRs called Lenin a traitor. But Lenin's arguments gained support. When the peace treaty was ratified on March 14th to 16th, 1918, there was little support for Bukharin's resolution to reject the treaty. Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, later wrote of the decision to conclude peace at the Seventh Party Congress. Quote, that decision had been the outcome of a bitter struggle. The fight was a sharp one. The Congress was attended by 46 delegates with decisive votes representing 300,000 party members. The party in those days was not what it is now. It lacked the unity which has since been achieved. 30 of the 46 delegates voted for the ratification of the Brest-Litovsk peace, and 12 against, with 4 abstentions. In other words, about a third of the delegates were against the line of the Central Committee, against Lenin's line. Among them were many prominent Bolsheviks. On February 23rd, 6 of them announced their resignation from high posts in the administration and the party, and reserved full freedom of agitation both within and outside the party. On February 24th, the Moscow Regional Bureau passed a resolution of no confidence in the Central Committee, refused to submit to those of its rulings which, quote, would be connected with the implementation of the terms of the peace treaty with Austro-Germany, unquote, and in the explanatory note to its resolution declared that, quote, a party split in the near future is scarcely avoidable, unquote. The Moscow Regional Bureau, early in 1918, acted as the organizational center of the left communists, on an all-Russian scale. One can understand the vehemence with which Lenin opposed the left communists and their revolutionary phrasemongering. On February 21, 1918, he wrote in Pravda, quote, "We must fight against revolutionary phrasemongering, fight at all cost, so that it may not be said of us afterwards in words of bitter truth, revolutionary phrasemongering about a revolutionary war killed the revolution." She continued, quote, "The Fourth Extraordinary All-Russian Congress of Soviets was to ratify the peace treaty. The left communists were even prepared to put up with the loss of the Soviet power. In their declaration of February 24th, they said, 'In the interests of the international revolution, we consider it expedient to consent to the possible loss of the Soviet power, which has now become purely formal.'" That phrase shocked Ilyich profoundly. Concerning the Fourth Congress of Soviets, she wrote, quote, "At the Fourth Extraordinary All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which took place on March 14th to 16th, Ilyich, that is, Lenin, addressing the representatives of the Soviets with the same deep earnestness and sincerity with which he always addressed the masses, casually let fall a phrase that characterizes him as a revolutionary and fighter. Quote, "They say we are surrendering the Ukraine, which Chernov, Kerensky, and Tsereteli are out to ruin. We are told, 'Traitors, you have betrayed the Ukraine.' I say, 'Comrades, I have seen a thing or two in the history of the revolution. More than enough to be daunted by the hostile glances and shouts of people who let themselves be carried away by their feelings and are unable to reason." Unquote. Hostile glances and shouts could not deter Ilyich, not even those of his most intimate comrades. But he was only human, and these clashes with people with whom he had been so closely associated distressed him greatly. He did not sleep at nights, and his nerves were in a bad state. On this occasion, however, a split was avoided. The Fourth All-Russian Congress of Soviets ratified the peace treaty by 724 votes against 276, with 118 abstentions. This Congress was attended not only by the Bolsheviks, of course. The Mensheviks, communist anarchists, and right and left socialist revolutionaries voted against the signing of the peace treaty. Their representatives opposed the acceptance of the German peace terms at the meeting of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee on February 23rd. With 724 votes cast against 276, this meant a sweeping victory for Lenin's line. The question of the peace treaty with the Germans having been settled, Ilyich regarded this as a respite which had to be made use of for developing the activities of the Soviet government within the country to the utmost. Trotsky became Commissar for War after resigning as Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and the left SRs that were part of the government resigned over the signing of the treaty. In early 1918, the Union for the Resurrection of Russia was created by Plekhanov, a leader of the Mensheviks, along with SRs, Popular Socialists, and chiefs of the Cadet Party. They wanted the Bolsheviks out of power and the country fighting in the Great War. The Soviet government in Russia had moved from Petrograd to Moscow on March 11th and 12th, 1918. Krupskaya later wrote of this, quote, "The German advance and the capture of Pskov by them showed what danger the government was exposing itself to by remaining in Petrograd. In Finland, civil war had broken out. It was decided to evacuate to Moscow. This was essential from the organizing point of view as well. The work had to be done in the center of the country's economic and political life. On March 12th, the Soviet government moved to Moscow, the center of Soviet Russia, which was at a safer distance from the frontiers and closer to a number of provinces with which closer contact had to be made." On March 11th, the day of the evacuation, Ilyich wrote an article entitled "The Main Task of Our Day," which was published in Izvestia on March 12th. This article was programmatic, and at the same time strikingly characteristic of Ilyich's mood at the time. Krupskaya. A force of 400 to 500 British Marines landed in Murmansk on March 18th. Krupskaya wrote that this was, quote, "ostensibly for the purpose of guarding the military stores set up there by the Entente under the Tsarist government. The idea behind this landing party was clear," unquote. Before moving into the Kremlin, her and Lenin stayed at the National Hotel, where they, quote, "were fed on English tinned meat, with which the English fed their soldiers at the front. Once, during the meal, Ilyich remarked, 'I wonder what we're going to feed our own soldiers with at the fronts,' unquote. Around this time, General Mannerheim requested assistance from the Germans in defeating the Finnish Revolution, and 30,000 soldiers led by General von der Goltz helped him do just that. In April 1918, Stalin put out an appeal to the Soviets of the national minorities that weren't under Bolshevik leadership. He said that it was important for people to be freed from bourgeois leadership, and that, quote, it is necessary to elevate the masses to the level of the Soviet regime, and to fuse their best representatives with the latter, but this is impossible without autonomy of these outlying regions. Gray. He also said that people should have the full right to use the local native language. The slogan, national in form, socialist in content, was associated with this. The following month, he opened a conference on the formation of an autonomous Tatar-Bashkir Soviet Republic. In part, he said that a purely nationalist autonomy would be undesirable, and that the country needed, quote, a strong Russian-wide state authority, capable of quelling conclusively the enemies of socialism and of organizing a new communist economy. Ibid. The central authority would deal with the most important, large-scale matters, and the autonomous regions would deal with more local matters. Stalin was also a member of the commission that drafted the first constitution, which was adopted in July 1918. It established the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. Later, the order of the words Socialist and Soviet would be swapped, which at the time had a treaty relationship with the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Transcaucasian Soviet republics. On June 20th, 1918, Kerensky, representing the Union for the Resurrection of Russia, was in London telling Prime Minister Lloyd George that they were forming a government whose aim was to resume involvement in the imperialist war and depose the Bolsheviks. They, of course, claimed they were supporting democracy. Yep, these types were already pulling that 100 years ago. Kerensky requested a so-called intervention from the West, and soon a directorate was formed in Siberia, with the SRs, Popular Socialists, and Tsarist generals Alexeyev and Boldyrev. The British and French states nearly recognized it as the official government, but went with Tsarist General Kolchak instead. Kerensky and the Union got their wish, as Winston Churchill instigated a summer invasion of Russia by Great Britain, France, the US, Italy, Japan, and others. 14 in all. In Moscow, left SRs and anarchists staged an armed revolt in the first week of July, calling the Bolsheviks betrayers of the revolution. Lenin introduced his program of development, which included nationalization of banks, workers' control of industry, land to the peasants, and peace. The Supreme Council of National Economy had been formed in December to bring order in the factories, and to work on plans for future nationalization. It was made up of people from trade unions, factory committees, government technical experts, and specialists. Lenin summed up the situation in the conclusion of the immediate tasks of the Soviet government. Quote, an extraordinarily difficult, complex, and dangerous situation in international affairs, the necessity of maneuvering and retreating, a period of waiting for new outbreaks of the revolution which is maturing in the West at a painfully slow pace. Within the country, a period of slow construction and ruthless tightening up, of prolonged and persistent struggle waged by stern, proletarian discipline against the menacing element of petty bourgeois laxity and anarchy. These, in brief, are the distinguishing features of the special stage of the socialist revolution in which we are now living. Try to compare with the ordinary everyday concept, revolutionary, the slogans that follow from the specific conditions of the present stage, namely, maneuver, retreat, wait, build slowly, ruthlessly tighten up, rigorously discipline, smash laxity. Excluding the banks and the land, only around 500 individual enterprises had been nationalized by July 1918. However, events were going to force the Soviet government into adopting what would be termed war communism, where nationalization, requisitioning, and rationing, quote, were to become drastic political weapons for the maintenance of Soviet power. Murphy. Laying out some of the challenges the new Soviet government faced in 1918, Sidney and Beatrice Webb wrote, quote, in 1918, the authority of the Soviet government was far from being firmly established. Even in Petrograd and Moscow, there was the very smallest security of life and property. The deliberate and long-continued blockade maintained by the British fleet, and supported by the other hostile governments, kept out alike food and clothing, and the sorely needed medicines and anesthetics. Presently came the armies of the governments of Great Britain, France, Japan, Italy, and the United States, without any declaration of war, actually invading at half a dozen points from Vladivostok and Batum to Murmansk and Archangel, the territory of what had never ceased to be technically a friendly power. The same governments, moreover, freely supplied officers, equipment, and munitions to the mixed forces raised by Denikin, Kolchak, Yudenich, and Wrangel, who took up arms against the Soviet government. Incidentally, the Germans and Poles ravaged the western provinces, whilst the army formed out of the Czechoslovakian prisoners of war held an equivocal position in its protracted passage through Siberia to the Pacific Ocean. As Murphy explained, quote, "The food situation was becoming increasingly serious as the forces of counter-revolution closed in from every side. They were threatening Tsaritsyn, now Stalingrad, and the whole system of food supply from the south when Stalin was charged with the task of securing the Republic's larder."